The world is changing. Inspiration is everywhere. It has never been so easy to connect, share, and bring people together. We're learning from others and finding the best in ourselves. Challenging our beliefs. Sharing our vulnerability. Overcoming our fears. Transforming ourselves so we can transform the world. How far can we go?
This is London Real. I am Brian Rose. My guest today is... This is London Real. I am Brian Rose. My guest today is Peter Schiff, the American economist, investment advisor, and financial commentator. Throughout your career, you have consistently made accurate predictions of major economic events. With your 2007 book, Crash Proof, forecasting the 2008 financial collapse while instructing people how to protect their assets. You regularly appear on television for CNBC, CNN, Fox News, and Bloomberg, and your work has been quoted in the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, and the Washington Post. With the global economy braced for a massive recession due to the global coronavirus lockdown, people are turning to you for insight on how to protect themselves from this looming financial crisis. Peter, it's been a few years. Welcome back to London Real.
Well, thanks for welcoming me back. Last time I was out there in London, but this time, we're all hunkered down with COVID-19. But you mentioned...
Before we get started, Peter, let me just say really quick before we get started, I want to announce to everybody that we're streaming now on our brand new Digital Freedom platform. And what it is a censorship-free, independent broadcasting system that is of the people, by the people, for the people. And it's available exclusively on our website at freedomplatform.tv. Just want to ask everyone now to please share this via the link in the sidebar to all your social media channels. Peter, I pledge to you and everyone watching this that none of this conversation will be edited, censored, removed, or banned, and that anyone in the world can watch the full version of this episode free at londonreal.tv/Schiff. Thanks to the generous donations of over 31,000 people around the world that we call the London Real Army. For anybody wanting to become a founding member of the platform, they can go to freedomplatform.tv/give to donate and fight with us on the front lines, because we are here to protect our human rights. At London Real, we've been a platform for free speech since 2011. And Peter, how do we start? You recently were quoted by saying the economy was sick long before the virus infected it. What do you see happening here these last few months?
Yeah, first of all, what I was starting to say is in your intro, you mentioned that I'm a frequent guest on a lot of these financial stations, and that's not the case anymore. I was a frequent guest before the 2008 financial crisis, and then for maybe a year or two subsequent to that crisis. But then they pretty much stopped inviting me on. So I'm really, you can hear me on YouTube now, on my, my own YouTube channel or the Schiff Report, my podcast. But I'm rarely on any of these networks that used to have me on a regular basis. I come on One American News once in a while or RT, but the CNBCs and the CNNs and Fox News, those networks don't really have me on anymore.
And why is that, Peter?
Well, probably because they don't want the truth. They want people to come out and just tell their audience how great everything is and how the U.S. economy is fantastic and the guys at the Fed are geniuses and there's nothing to worry about. Everything is great. Just buy bonds, buy stocks, and don't worry. And I think part of it, too, is that I've been warning about the crisis that we're heading for a long time. And I guess sometimes they think, well, you've been saying this stuff for a while. And they forget how long I was warning about the 2008 financial crisis before that one finally hit. Now, I would admit that I've been warning about this one even longer, but it's going to be a much worse crisis. And in fact, what's happened right now with COVID-19, that's not the problem. I'm not going to diminish the fact that, yes, there is a health threat there. That's a problem. But the economic problem is not COVID-19. It's not even the shutdowns and the quarantines or the social distancing. That's a problem. But the bigger problem is not COVID-19. That COVID-19 is the pin, maybe. What's really the problem is the bubble that the pin helped prick. And in fact, I think the air was coming out of the bubble anyway. And so what happened was COVID just put a gaping hole into a bubble that was already leaking air. And so now the air has come gushing out. But I think that the financial collapse that I had been warning about for a decade is now much closer because of COVID-19. But because we succeeded in kicking the can down the road for a decade, the crisis is now going to be much bigger than the one that I contemplated back then. I think the dollar's demise is going to be far greater. I think the probability of actual hyperinflation is higher now than it was then. So I think the stakes are higher. I think ultimately the profits that people will make betting against the dollar, betting on gold-related equities, and basically avoiding U.S. assets, I think the profits are going to be a lot bigger now as well, because it's a bigger bubble. A lot more air is going to come out. That means a lot more gain for the people who are properly positioned.
Peter, I got a lot of normal people that watch the show that don't necessarily play the markets. And when they see Trump come out and say, I'm putting a $6 trillion, stimulus package in, or here in the UK, where they had these furlough programs where they're guaranteeing 80% of the wage, your average person thinks, oh, this is great. This is fantastic. This is what I needed to survive. But you see it completely different, right? You see it as actually something that's really going to hurt them in the long run. Can you explain that to the average person?
Well, people seem to be under the impression that governments just have this pile of money and that, normally they're kind of stingy with it and they don't want to share it with the people. But then, when there's a crisis, there's an emergency, all of a sudden they become more generous with this money and they just dole it out. And, oh, this is great. The government's going to help us. Now we're going to get all this extra money. And that's going to replace the money I'm no longer earning because I'm not working, I'm not productive. But it's okay. The government's just going to share this windfall with me. And this is all a bunch of nonsense. The government doesn't have anything, right? The government doesn't produce. They're not providing goods and services. All they do is print money, right? The central banks create money. And what money does, when you're talking about fiat money, right? Currency that's backed by nothing, just currency that central banks literally conjure out of thin air, right? That money in and of itself has no value. What happens is the people that have that money can use it to buy the goods and services that the market is providing. And so the more money in circulation, the higher the price of those goods and services. So when the government creates money and gives it to people, when those people who get the money spend it, they're simply buying something that other people can no longer afford because the price went up, right? The government isn't adding new production to the economy. It's just adding additional claims to the existing stock of production of goods and services. So it isn't a windfall, right? The government cannot support the people. It's the other way around. The government only has the resources it takes from the people. The people support government. Government can't support the people. Now, can the government support some people at the expense of others? Yes, the government can take from Peter to pay Paul, but that means Paul has lost something in order for Peter to get something. But what everybody thinks now is that Paul can get money and Peter, that the government doesn't have to take from anybody and can give to everybody. And this is a fiction. This is all going to end in tears because all we're doing is creating inflation. We are destroying the value of money in order to print more of it and to, distribute it. But, what we're getting now is more money, but less stuff, because people who used to be employed productively, producing goods and providing services are now sitting at home. And instead of getting paid for their contribution by their employer, they're just getting money for nothing from the government. They're putting nothing in, but they're getting checks to take something out. And so we're all going to be trying to bid for a diminished supply of goods and services with newly created money. And it's just inflation. But the problem is going to be greatest in the United States because we are printing more than anybody else. And I think that the dollar is going to lose its status as the reserve currency. We're going to have a dollar crisis, and the dollar is going to lose a tremendous percentage of its value, much more so than other fiat currencies. And it's going to mean a complete collapse in the American standard of living.
So the U.S. national debt is at nearly $26 trillion, I've heard you say. What does that mean to people? Is there any way you can kind of give people a comparison as far as why that is potentially a dangerous number?
Well, first of all, it's the tip of the iceberg because that is only the Treasury debt that's outstanding. So that's bonded, funded debt, where the government has borrowed money and issued a formal IOU in the form of a Treasury security. But those are not the only debts that the US government is obligated to repay, right? If you look at all of the debt that we're on the hook for, right, the unfunded liabilities, which would include commitments to pay Social Security benefits, Medicare benefits, pensions to government retirees. And then if you look at a lot of debt that the US government has guaranteed, such as student loans or mortgages or things like that, and you try to ascribe some type of liability for that, because we know that some of the debts are going to go bad and the government is going to be on the hook based on its prior commitments. So if you actually take a fair accounting of the unfunded liabilities, there you're talking about like $150 trillion. So you're talking about a number that is more than 5 times greater than the official national debt that we're talking about when you're talking about this $26 trillion. But to put that $26 trillion in perspective, that's about 8 years of the current tax revenue, right? That's 8 years of taxation to repay that debt, which obviously shows you that the debt is completely unrepayable. There's no way to do that because that's 8 years of tax revenue where the government spends nothing on anything else, which is impossible. The government can't spend zero in order to repay its debt. If you look at it as a percentage of GDP, right now we're at about 120% of GDP, the size of that debt. But of course, American taxpayers are also on the hook for the debts of the state and local governments. So when you add on those debts, I think the total claim on GDP by government on all levels is more like, I think, about 140%, but it's escalating quickly. In fact, right now, the US government is borrowing more money than it raises in taxes. I think almost 52 cents of every federal dollar spent has been borrowed. I mean, think about that for a minute. This is how the US government is running itself, not on taxation, but on debt. And of course, the Federal Reserve is buying probably all of that debt. So the government is already running itself with a printing press rather than through legitimate taxation. The only reason that we appear solvent is because the average cost to fund the national debt, the interest is 1.5%. And so because we're only paying 1.5% interest on 26 trillion of debt, it looks like the debt is affordable. But if interest rates were to ever normalize, I mean, forget about interest rates being high. Remember in 1980, they went to 20%. But, you know, even if they went to 5% today, you know, you would be looking at spending more in interest than we do in Social Security. In fact, we'd be spending more on interest than Medicare. It'd be the biggest line item in the budget. And in fact, if interest rates went to about 5%, about 40% of every tax dollar would go to interest on the national debt. Think about that. The government collects $1 in taxes. 40 cents of that dollar would go just to paying interest on the debt that we have. I mean, they wouldn't be paying off any of the principal, just servicing the interest. And of course, if interest rates went to something like 10%, then the government would have to spend more in interest than it collects in taxes, which obviously is impossible. But the US government is insolvent. And if we ever had a spike in interest rates, we would have to default on the debt. And if we didn't default, we'd have massive or hyperinflation. So we have gone beyond the point of no return. The key is, when is the world going to wake up to the reality of American insolvency and stop loaning America additional money?
You mentioned inflation. I'm trying to give people a good example of what that might look like. I remember Brazil, like in the 80s, where they just kept printing money. We've heard about Germany in the 30s, maybe Venezuela now. Like, to get people's head around inflation, like what's happening when there is an inflationary environment?
Well, when you have hyperinflation, right, which is what you're describing, you know, money is like a hot potato. I mean, nobody wants to hold on to it because it's going to lose value quickly. And so as soon as you get it, you got to turn around and spend it, because if you hold it too long, you won't be able to buy very much. So, the velocity really picks up, and you have a real loss of confidence among the population in the future purchasing power of that, medium of exchange. And that is going to happen. We have put ourselves into a position where ultimately the dollar is going to implode. The only thing that is standing between the dollar and, hyperinflation now is the fact that it's the world's reserve currency. So we're able to get away with this. We can keep printing money and exporting it. And nations all around the world are willing to hold on to the money that we're printing. And so therefore that money is not in the US economy bidding up goods and services. It's being hoarded outside the United States, and it's being invested in financial assets. A lot of it, US government obligations or other debt instruments. So instead of all the money chasing real goods, it's chasing financial assets. And so it's not a problem, at least it doesn't appear to be a problem, when government creates inflation and the inflation results in asset prices going up. I mean, apart from increasing the big disparity between the very rich and the rest of the population, right? The wealth disparity continues to grow as inflation, shows up in financial assets. But eventually, the world is going to figure this out. The world is not going to want to continue to subsidize this extreme profligacy or especially now that we have really turned it up. I mean, we have increased government spending by, I'd say, 50% since COVID-19. I mean, the federal government now is spending $6.7 trillion a year and rising, and that's not going to go down. I mean, every time the government has ratcheted up spending in the past because there was an emergency, the extra spending never goes away. It just becomes permanent part of the budget. So we have dramatically escalated the size of the US government and the cost of maintaining it. And if the American public is not going to bear that burden, then the rest of the world is going to have to do it by absorbing all the dollars that we are spending. And this is going to exert a tremendous cost on the world as far as, the expense of underwriting this. They have to supply us with the goods that we don't produce, and they have to loan us the money that we haven't saved. But I think when they basically enough, right, when they balk at this, then they're not going to want to buy any more treasuries. They're not going to want to buy any debt instruments that are denominated in U.S. currency because they know they're not going to get paid back.
Let me ask you a question.
Because if we can't repay our debts, there's only two options: default or inflate. But either way, whoever loaned us the money is going to lose. And so if you know you're going to guarantee lose, then why enter into the transaction in the first place? And then once that happens,
let me ask you a question.
The party's over.
Okay, you ran for Senate in 2010. Say, for example, you were president right now. What would you have done, or what should have President Trump have done in this instance? Not give out the money, allow corporations to fail? Like, what is the right call right now?
Well, I mean, first of all, Donald Trump had an opportunity to do the right thing when he first became president, right? He could have continued the same theme that helped him become president, right? When he ran for office, he said we had a phony economy, we had fake numbers, that we had a bubble that was inflated by the Fed, we had a stock market bubble, interest rates were artificially low, we needed to make America great again, we needed to drain the swamp, we needed to reindustrialize the country, we needed to start producing things and shrinking the trade deficit and reducing the size of government and pay off the national debt. So he said a lot of good things to become president. The problem is, once he became president, he abandoned everything he campaigned on, and he became exactly what he was criticizing, a career politician. He became part of the very swamp that he wanted to drain. In fact, he made the swamp deeper. The US government spending increased substantially under Donald Trump, right? And so Trump actually increased taxes because government spending is taxation. The fact that they cut income taxes just means that we're paying for government through an alternative means, and that means was debt and inflation. So Trump squandered the opportunity to do the right thing initially. What I would have done had I been elected president in 2016 I would have leveled with the American public about the nature of the problem, how it was created by the Federal Reserve and by Congress with, all these bubbles and government. And I would have said, here's what we need to do. We need to shrink government dramatically. We need to eliminate the burden that government places on this economy. So we're going to dramatically cut government spending. We're going to eliminate entire agencies and departments. We are going to substantially reduce or eliminate entitlements, including, Social Security, Medicare, things like that, Obamacare. We're going to make government much, much smaller. Also, the Federal Reserve has to let interest rates go up. We can't keep artificially suppressing rates, and so rates have to go higher. And higher interest rates would have brought about a collapse in the stock market, a collapse in the real estate market. There would have been a lot of bankruptcies. A lot of investors would have lost money, but we would have cleaned house. We would have restructured the economy. We would have created a foundation that we could have grown, a real economy on. And with the burden of government dramatically removed from the economy, American companies would be a lot more productive, a lot more competitive. And maybe by now we would be on the upswing. But we didn't do that. We made the problems bigger. We inflated an even bigger bubble. We continued the same failed policies of Obama, which was a continuation of the failed policies under Bush, which continued the failed policies under Clinton. But given where we are now, what should Trump do now? Tell the truth now. I mean, hey, we didn't have a great economy before COVID. I was lying about that. We had a big bubble. It wasn't the greatest economy the world has ever seen. It was just the biggest bubble the world has ever seen. And now we just ran into the biggest pin in COVID-19. And because of prior mistakes, we are ill prepared to deal with this crisis. Trump said that, the government has to support the people during this downturn because, COVID-19 was nobody's fault and therefore nobody should lose their jobs. No businesses should fail. It should be like World War II, right? Everybody has to come together like World War II. Except when we actually had World War II, it was a very different conversation. Roosevelt came to the American public and said, we have an emergency. Therefore, I have to raise your taxes dramatically. The government needs money to fight the Japanese. The government needs money to fight the Nazis. And so we need to raise your taxes. And so taxes went up dramatically during the Second World War. I mean, in 1940, fewer than 3% of Americans paid the income tax. By 1942, because of the victory tax, better than 30% of Americans paid the income tax. And in fact, that's when income taxes started coming out of people's paychecks in 1942. The government took that money so it could fight the war. Then Roosevelt also said to the American people, we need to borrow from you. It's not enough to triple your taxes. That's not going to cut it. We need even more money. So we need you to buy these war bonds. And so the U.S. government sold war bonds to the American public. And the American public loaned the U.S. government the equivalent of trillions of dollars. So in addition to paying way more taxes, Americans loaned money to the government. Where did they get all this money to loan to the government? Well, A, they had savings, which Americans don't have today. But B, families stopped spending. They didn't go to restaurants. They didn't go out to the theater. They didn't travel and take vacations. Instead, they loaned that money to the U.S. government by buying war bonds. No businesses got bailed out, right? How many businesses were disrupted by World War II? We had 16 million American men, young men, that we shipped over to Asia and Europe. Those 16 million customers were no longer patronizing businesses. What happened to those businesses? Did anybody get a check from the government? No, nobody got a check from the government. Everybody was sending checks to the government. The people supported the government during World War II. Now, Donald Trump and Congress is acting as if the government can support the people as we fight a war on COVID-19. How is that possible? I mean, if this was true, why didn't we do the same thing back in 1941? Why didn't Roosevelt say, hey, nobody has to worry about losing their jobs. Nobody has to worry about paying their rent. I mean, this war is nobody's fault. I mean, it's not your fault that the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor. So don't worry. No one's going to have to pay higher taxes to fight this war. Nobody's going to have to buy any war bonds. We're just going to print money, and that's how we're going to pay for the war. We'd have lost the war in a heartbeat. The Japanese and the Germans would have killed us because in order to have bombers, in order to have tanks and ammunition, you can't print that stuff. It has to be produced. You need real.
And we were still on the gold standard back then.
War. And the same is true to fight the war on COVID-19. We can't fight it with a printing press.
Okay, and we were on the gold standard back then, which meant you couldn't print anyways, or it was very difficult.
Well, right, you needed real money.
Right.
We had to earn our gold by exporting, or we had to mine it out of the ground. But that doesn't change the dynamics.
Yeah. No.
There is no free lunch. You can't get something for nothing.
Yeah.
And so what the government is doing now, the bailouts and the stimulus, is far more damaging to the economy than COVID-19. Right? What the government is doing in reaction to COVID-19 is far worse than COVID-19. And I'm not just talking about ordering businesses to shut down. I'm talking about the bailouts and the stimulus for the businesses that have shut down, for the people who have lost their jobs. It would be better, even if we forced companies to shut down, it would be better if nobody got a bailout. But the problem is we can't afford it. If we had a real economy, the way we had a real economy in 1941, right? When COVID-19 came, we would have ample savings. Nobody would be living paycheck to paycheck. I mean, nobody even heard of that in 1941. People had enough savings to have 6 months or a year's worth of mortgage payments or rent payments or whatever they had. Nobody would live paycheck to paycheck back then. It was unheard of. Companies had lots of savings. So what would have happened if we had a healthy economy, we would have been able to take a few months off and we could have dipped into our savings that tied us over. But we didn't. The Fed inflated a massive bubble where nobody had any savings. Corporations were loaded up with debt from buying back stock. Individuals, credit card debt, auto loans, student loans, mortgage debt. Nobody has any savings. The governments were broke. State and federal governments broke. Local governments. Nobody had surpluses. Everybody was like borrowing money. So when this happened, right, all of a sudden, we have no rainy day fund. And then it doesn't just rain, it pours. And we got nothing. And the reason we got nothing is because of the Fed, because they kept interest rates too low all these years. They punished people for saving. They encouraged people to go deeper into debt. And they created this economy that was so vulnerable to any pin.
And also the people are,
COVID-19.
they're not, it's almost like we're privileged. We're not like accustomed to austerity or taking hits or, like I said, I remember the war bonds. I remember those ads. These days, it's all about how everything is going to get back to normal. You're going to be able to keep spending like you used to. You're going to have your barbecues and your movies and your cars. Again, it's almost like we've become this, like I said, privileged society that doesn't have to take hits when it's time to take hits. It's almost like
that's not normal. See, that's the problem. People think that was normal. That was abnormal. Yeah. We can't go back to that. That was the bubble that has since popped. The air has come out. We can't go back to that. Going back to normal means a real economy that is based on underconsumption, based on savings. And then savings is what gives you capital formation and allows for production and economic growth. We had an abnormal debt bubble thanks to the Federal Reserve, right? They inflated this bubble and we can't go back to that. That is the problem. You still have so many people who think that the economy was in good shape before COVID-19. It was in horrible shape. It was very sick long before the virus came around.
Right. Okay.
And so even if we cure it, even if we get a vaccine, it's not going to matter from the perspective of the economy. Yes, it's better health-wise, but it's not going to put the air back into that bubble.
Well, no, you mentioned the vaccine. What do you actually see happening in the next 6 months? Do you see this V-shaped recovery? Do you see this vaccine making everything okay to where we can go back to at least live in this bubble economy? Do you see Trump getting reelected? And then at some point, I want to ask you why the stock market is still up. But first of all, do you see us getting back to normal, or do you see certain industries never coming back ever again?
Well, as I said, the way it was before COVID-19, at least in America, was not normal. And so we're not going to go back to that. I think we will go back to an actual normal, but that's a very, very deep depression from here. We have to go through a huge economic contraction to get back to actual normalcy. And the road between here and normalcy is a very treacherous one. And a lot of people are going to get wiped out, right? A lot of businesses are going to fail. A lot of people are going to lose money. All of that has to happen in order to get back to a normal economy. Now, nobody wants to go back to a normal economy. They want to go back to the bubble that we had before. I just don't think that's possible. I don't think that there's enough air to reflate that bubble. I think that the federal government is going to try, the Federal Reserve is going to try, but they will fail. Now, I thought they were going to fail last time, right? When I was forecasting the 2008 financial crisis before it happened, because I knew that it was going to happen, at the time, back when I wrote Crash Proof in 2006, and I said that when the real estate bubble popped, we would have a financial crisis. I said the government and the Fed would try to reflate the real estate bubble, reflate the stock market bubble by slashing interest rates and printing all this money and run trillion-dollar deficits. And, they did exactly what I forecast they would do to a problem that they didn't even know existed, but which I could see coming from a mile away. But my thought back then was that their attempt to reflate those bubbles would fail and that the dollar would crash before they can finish that mission. And then we would have an economic collapse. That's what I got wrong. They didn't just attempt to reflate the bubbles. They actually succeeded. And in fact, not only did they reflate the bubbles, they made them bigger than they were before. I underestimated the ability of the Fed to be able to do that because I probably overestimated the intelligence of the rest of the world to figure out what was going on. But since the government was able to succeed in making the bubble so big, I don't think there's any way they're going to be able to repeat what they did last time. I think now we're going to get the dollar crisis that I thought we would have had a while ago, right? In response to the stimulus that followed the 2008 financial crisis. Instead, we're going to get the dollar crisis in response to the stimulus that we have now, right? This is the last time. It's not going to be the third time is the charm. It's going to be 3 strikes and you're out because the Fed got away with this after the dot-com bubble popped too.
Right.
And so people think they're going to make it a hat trick. They're not. The numbers are just too big. I already went over just the sheer enormity of the debt. So we're not going to successfully reflate these bubbles. We are going to destroy the dollar. The dollar is going to crash. It's going to take the bond market and then the U.S. economy along with it. And so we're not going to get a V-shaped recovery. This is going to look like a lightning bolt, right? It's, we got to line down and then we're going to start to go up and people are going to think it's going to be a V, but then it's going to turn down and turn into a lightning bolt.
That's dark, Peter. These are dark times you're talking about. I mean, this changes societies, right? This changes families. This changes the psyche of a nation to go through something like that. And we're not ready for it. People aren't tough enough, are they?
No, I mean, we're a bunch of sheep. Everybody wants something for nothing from the government. I mean, that's the type of nation that we have now. People are looking for a handout. People think they're entitled to stuff simply because they exist. Right? The government, I should have health care, I should have housing,
universal basic income,
food, I should have clothing, that I have a right to things. And that's not true. The only thing you have a right to is your freedom. You have a right to be left alone so you can pursue all the things that you want. You can pursue property, you can pursue happiness, but you don't have a right to any of those things because you don't have a right to take things away from other people. But that's what you're doing. When you're asking the government to provide you with something, you're asking the government to steal those things from other people and give them to you. Because the government itself, as I said, has nothing. It only has what it takes. And people don't realize that when they're voting for free stuff, they're actually committing robbery. They're just doing it under the guise of government, and somehow they think it's on a moral higher plane when you rob somebody using an intermediary. And I don't differentiate between that. I mean, putting on a mask and stealing something is the same thing as voting for somebody who then steals it under the color of law, because it's still theft.
And what about universal basic income? Andrew Yang, the presidential candidate, briefly was talking about it. You know, over here in the UK, the government is guaranteed 80% of wages. And people are saying this is just a way going down this universal basic income thing, which also means you're going to have to behave according to what the government says. But that's another issue. Speak on that, Peter.
Yeah, look, it's a bad idea. But the question is it a worse idea than what we already have, right? Because right now we have all these needs-based welfare programs. And there's a lot of problems with those in that people are incentivized not to work, because if they work, they lose all their government benefits, which is like a tax. And if you think about that, if you go from welfare to work, not only do you have to pay taxes on the money that you earn, but you lose 100% of the benefits you got for nothing. So in many cases, the highest marginal tax rate there is to go from welfare to employment. And so that is a big barrier. It discourages people from seeking employment because they give up so much. It's not worth it. Because if you get paid to not work, right, that you have a lot of leisure. There's a value to that. You know, if you have to give up all that leisure in order to commute to a job every day, that's a big sacrifice. So jobs have to be far more lucrative than leisure, right? Because even if the money is equal, if I can make the same amount of money working as I make not working, who's going to choose working? I mean, it's much better not to work. So the current welfare systems that we have discourage people who might otherwise be productive in work. We encourage them to sit back and live off the productivity of everybody else. So society is made poor. The idea behind universal basic income would be, hey, let's give everybody a certain amount of money, regardless of whether they work or not. So it's no longer a negative factor, right, to work. It doesn't discourage you, because if you don't lose your benefits by getting a job, well, then maybe more people will take a job. And there's arguments to be made there. And there's also probably less fraud because if everybody gets the money, then you don't have to lie to qualify for it. And I think there's a lot of fraud in welfare systems where people just, commit fraud to qualify for these benefits. And now you have to have government bureaucrats who are trying to ferret out the fraud and determining whether people are getting the benefits if they're really entitled to them. And if everybody gets the benefit, regardless of their employment status or their income, then you don't have fraud, and you don't have to waste all the resources trying to ferret out the fraud. So you can make an argument that universal basic income is less bad. Now, what Yang wanted to do was the worst of both worlds. He didn't want to get rid of welfare. He just wanted to add the UBI on top of the welfare. I mean, so that made no sense whatsoever. And the other thing that you have to do if you're going to have universal basic income is you have to get rid of the minimum wage. I mean, that is one of the best selling points of UBI, is because now you don't need the minimum wage anymore, because people are already getting that cushion from the government. And that is, again, probably the best part, because the minimum wage makes it illegal for a lot of low-skilled people to get jobs. And it puts the onus of supporting them maybe on an employer. But if you have society providing the universal basic income, then people can take whatever jobs their labor would qualify them for. So you could work for $2 an hour, $3 an hour, $4 an hour, because all of that simply adds to the basic income that you already have. And once you let people get their foot on the job ladder and they can start acquiring skills, well, then they may be able to earn $20 an hour or $50 an hour. But a lot of these people that could have eventually earned $20 or $50 an hour never earn anything, because the minimum wage at maybe $8 or $10 prevents them from ever getting their first job. And so if they can't get their first job, they can't climb the ladder. They can't acquire the higher skills that would enable them to earn a lot more than the minimum wage, because the minimum wage is a barrier to entry. And so at least with UBI, if you eliminate the minimum wage, you make it easier for people to get jobs and to acquire skills and to earn a lot more than the minimum wage. The negative part about the UBI is you will have a group of people who will be so lazy that they will just say, you know what, UBI is all I need. Who needs to work? My lifestyle is such, I'm just going to live off of this UBI, right? And obviously, the higher you make it, the more people who are just going to decide that leisure is so important to them, they don't want to work. And as long as you take care of their basic needs, if they're going to eat, if they're going to be clothed, if they're going to have a place to live, I don't need anything else, right? I'm just going to take the UBI and I'm going to milk it for all I can. So that's the problem. But again, I don't like the whole concept that people should get something for nothing, by holding taxpayers hostage at gunpoint. I think that people need to fend for themselves. They need to rely on themselves. And if they can't, for whatever reason, if they simply cannot earn enough money to feed themselves or to clothe themselves, then they can turn to private charities for that help. And I do think that human beings are basically good, and they will voluntarily help out people who are truly in need. And so I think that the private sector will be much more efficient at distributing charity to the people who actually need it than the government. I mean, the government perpetuates poverty, they trap people in poverty, and money gets distributed to people who don't need it, and it's very inefficient. Something like 90% of all the money the government takes in taxes is used to support the government. So only 10 cents goes to the recipients of the aid. So 90% of it is lost. Private charities, it's the opposite. They collect $1 and distribute 90 cents. It only costs 10 cents to administer the charity. So
I'm having
the free
flashbacks.
market is more efficient at everything, including taking care of the truly needy.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. I'm having flashbacks, Peter, to the time when you went down to the Occupy Wall Street demonstrations in 2008 down at whatever that park was on the park. You walked in with a suit. Yeah, what was it?
Zuccotti Park.
You walked in with a suit and tie and a video camera and decided to debate the people on the ground about them complaining against the 1%. First of all, I'm surprised you didn't get, killed on the spot, but you had these lengthy, multiple-hour conversations I think people can still watch on your YouTube channel. I mean, I'm just curious, what were some of the things that you talked to people about? Because I'm guessing that minimum wage came up. I'm guessing that the 1%ers came up. I'm just wondering off the top of your head, what were some of the things, because you have a great way, Peter, of explaining to people who would normally be on the socialist spectrum, the welfare spectrum, the minimum wage spectrum, of explaining basic tenets of capitalism that make them think, maybe Peter's right. Maybe we should let this system play out.
Yeah, well, I originally did that with Reason TV, and there were all sorts of stations on YouTube that picked it up. I finally got around to posting it about a year or two ago on my own YouTube channel, and I've got over 2 million views on it since I posted it. So if you want to see it, you could just go Peter Schiff, Occupy Wall Street. It's on my website, so you can watch the video. It's unedited, about 2 hours, and I stopped because we ran out of batteries, and we were running out of light, and I had theater tickets that night while I was in New York. So otherwise, I could have just stayed and kept on going. We had a big crowd. But a lot of people have emailed me, and I still get emails now from people who have watched it, who tell me that they were liberal, they were socialists, and now they're not because they watched that video. And maybe it wasn't just the video itself that opened their eyes, but what it did is it at least opened them wide enough where they could do some more research and realize that they were wrong in what they believed about capitalism and socialism and the free market. So I achieved that. I'm not sure how many people in that park, if anybody in the park, walked away from that encounter, changing their mind. But I know a lot of people who were watching on YouTube changed their minds. And that was really what my target was, because I knew it was being filmed and it would be online. And so that was what my goal was. I mean, yes, I knew I was going to attempt to get the people in the park, but there weren't enough of them. I mean, maybe there was 100 people there, whereas millions were watching online. But the motivating factor in what I was trying to convey was that the people who were protesting, their sentiments, while valid, were misplaced, right? They were upset at Wall Street because at the time, right, Wall Street was getting bailed out. Now everybody's getting bailed out, right? Doesn't matter what street you're on. Everybody's getting a bailout now. But back then, the bailouts were concentrated to the banks, right? Because the banks held all the mortgages. Now it's all debt that's going bad, right? Not just mortgage debt. Nobody could pay at this point. But back then, it was just, people who had borrowed from banks, people who bought homes and had mortgages. And so the banks were getting bailed out. And so the protesters were protesting the bailouts. And they said, this is a rigged economy. And I said, precisely. But it's not Wall Street that's rigging it. It's the government. You should be protesting on Pennsylvania Avenue. You should be protesting the Fed. Don't protest the people who took the bailouts. After all, if someone's offering to bail you out, you'd be a fool not to take it. Don't blame the ones who are being bailed out. Blame the ones who are doing the bailing. Blame the government for offering the money, not for the banks for taking it. Anybody's going to take money if someone offers it to them. It's the government that never should have made the offer. The Federal Reserve never should have financed the bailouts. So my point was, that's who you need to protest.
To continue watching the rest of the episode for free, visit our website londonreal.tv or click the link in the description below.